Okay, so the next thing we're doing is the fermented foods stage of the lab.
Yes.
And so you have to ask, what pray tell is a fermented food? And so part of the answer to that is that it is a means towards food preservation. So if you have foods that are only available at certain times of the year, but you want to eat them more than just those certain times of the year, you have to often preserve those foods in some way. And you can keep them in cold, but that's a relatively recent phenomenon or something that you can only do farther up north. You can salt your foods, and that's actually something that we're going to address a little bit today as osmosis. Where basically the salt draws water out of cells, and as a consequence, cells are unable to replicate, so the food is preserved. Sugar does the same thing. Or alternatively, well, I guess you could dry foods, that's another way of doing it, but alternatively you can ferment foods. And fermenting foods is an example of microbial antagonism. And what that means is you allow good bacteria to grow and they keep the bad bacteria from growing. So you're sort of causing the food to rot, but it's rotting it in a good way. And so there are lots of different types of fermented foods out there. Some of them it's not necessarily for the sake of preservation that you are fermenting them. And a good example of that is bread. Bread is fermented so that the bread will rise, so that you have this nice fluffy stuff rather than stuff that is hard as a rock. But alcoholic beverages are an example of a fermented food. Cheeses, not all cheeses, but most cheeses that at least historically are fermented foods. Chocolate turns out to be a fermented food. Indian chutneys are fermented foods. Pickles, half-sour pickles, of which we have some with us, are fermented foods. Hot pepper sauces, such as Tabasco sauce. Tabasco sauce is fermented for 3 years as a fermented food. Indian pickle is a fermented food. Kefir is a fermented food. Well, we've got some kefir with us. Kimchi is a fermented food. We have kimchi with us, and you'll see a video on that. Miso is a fermented food. Something called nam is a fermented food, and I have a video on that. Salamis, including pepperoni, are fermented foods. Sauerkraut, at least traditionally made sauerkraut, is a fermented food, and we'll have videos on both of those. Sour cream is a fermented food, that's why it's sour. Soy sauce is a fermented food. Aspergillus is the fungus that makes soy sauce. Anything that is alcoholic, including the spirits, are fermented foods, but they have to be distilled as well. Tempeh is a fermented food. Vinegar is a product of fermentation. Wine is a fermented food. And yogurt, of which we have some, is a fermented food. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through various fermented foods, starting out with basically sauerkraut, although it's a fermented vegetable that's being shown here.